Richard G. Kyle Faculty Lecture. It's my pleasure every year to, well, I guess last year's chalked up to COVID, but we didn't get it last year. But this is the 24th such lecture. And for those who don't know who Dr. Kyle is, he's in the room. Dick? So this is one of our beloved emeriti professor. If I have it right, Dick, you 41 years, right? Yes. Here? Yeah, 41 years. So he's been retired a couple years now. Historian and sort of jack of all trades through the years at Tabor College. And so this lectureship is named in his honor thanks to the generosity of Bill and Joyce Lowen. They endowed this several years ago, and so all of this is courtesy of them, with tribute to Dick, and now tonight with this list of participants in honor of Aleen as well. And so I'm so looking forward to this. I've heard snippets of this story over the last several years. This is my 11th year at Tabor, so this is the first time to get the whole Megillah. So I'm really looking forward to that. And so with that, I'm going to invite Dr. Deborah Pinner, the Associate Dean for the School of Liberal Arts, to come and introduce our speaker tonight.
I need to put this down just a bit. Isn't it just wonderful in here, folks? Yeah, wonderful room, and so happy to be back here after a year of not having this event. I'm remembering of a number of evenings where we were in this room, and we had windows back across that wall, and we kept dreaming about the one day when we would have a fine arts center, and now we have it, and we're just so grateful for it. Dr. Aleen Ratzlaff deserves praise for her faithful service as a well-regarded member of our community, as a professor to her students, and as a model for her peers. Aleen has been a support to me personally, as her former Humanities Division Chair and now Associate Dean of the School of Liberal Arts. When I ask her to participate in an activity or for input on an issue, she also often and eagerly says yes. This means a great deal to me as an academic leader. Thank you. When the Communication and English departments merged several years ago, Chris, Dick, and I have appreciated her eagerness to collaborate with us as a team. As with all things academic, we learn to expect change over time. It is with very deep sadness that we note that the position that she has held for the last 20 plus years will move from the Liberal Arts School to the School of Professional Studies next academic year. We will miss you, but we trust that you will still collaborate with us and attend our social events. Please welcome Dr. Ratzlaff as she presents her faculty lecture entitled One Side of the Paper Only, Out-of-Town Correspondence in the Black Press of the Plains during the 1920s. Her lecture is based on her ongoing archival research and focuses on black newspapers published in Kansas City, Oklahoma City, and Wichita. Dr. Ratzlaff.
Thank you. It is indeed an honor to be here and to be able to share what is my heart when it comes to doing research. So I want to start by just thanking, I'm so glad that Dick and Joyce are here, that we can continue to share this celebration of scholarship. And so it's so good to see you all here. And I see some other emeriti faculty here too, and so that's just been really good. I want to start with reminding you, some of you will know this, some of you may not. On May 31, 2021, will mark 100 years since the Tulsa Race Massacre. It was a riot that involved mobs of whites who attacked black-owned businesses, homes, and residents in Tulsa. This was part of what has been known as the Greenwood District, which is often referred to as the Black Wall Street of Tulsa. There it was named after an avenue that runs through the city, and there were prosperous homes of African Americans there, businesses that were thriving. I have one source that I want to read a quote. On Greenwood Avenue, there were luxury shops, restaurants, grocery stores, hotels, jewelry, and clothing stores, movie theaters, barbershops, and saloons, a library, pool halls, nightclubs, and offices for doctors, lawyers, and dentists. Greenwood also had its own school system, post office, a savings and loan bank, hospital, and bus and taxi service. We're talking about Jim Crow era. It was very much a segregated time, and this is the time period that I'm talking about tonight. And in the midst, I just feel like it's important to realize that particular context in what I share about the Black press. So let me find my clicker. There it is. So I'm going to give you a picture of a church that burned that day. And I also want to show you the headline of the Black Dispatch on the first weekend or the first week of publication after the riot. The Black Dispatch was an African American newspaper that published in Oklahoma City and was distributed into many of the Black communities in Oklahoma and beyond. I also want to share another page from that issue. It's called The Sooner Trail. And if you're able to, I know you can't read this. If I look here at the page, each of these are entries that correspondents have sent in to the newspaper about events that are happening in their communities. If you look on the side, I was going to ask Garrett how to pronounce Omogi. Am I saying it right? Okmulgee. You can tell I'm not from Oklahoma. All right, and the correspondent was D.F. Wilson. And so one of the things that I found interesting, I sort of anticipated or expected to find a lot more about the Tulsa riot in these reports that the correspondents were sending in. I didn't find very much, but I did find one from D.F. Wilson. And so I'll just read it here. The local NAACP, the Ready Help Club, the Black Cross Nurse, and other organizations are doing teamwork along the line of raising funds as a result of the Tulsa riot. Judge D.J. Wallace called a meeting of the local NAACP Friday evening, June 3. In a few minutes, more than $600 in cash and needful articles were donated. A committee was named to solicit aid for the Tulsa sufferers. D.J. Wallace, Reverend J.A. Anderson, and Mrs. Sanders, Mrs. Foster, and Mrs. Adams. The East Side Ready to Help Club met Wednesday evening in the home of Mrs. Jessie Sparks. Quite an interesting meeting was held. 2 new members were added to the club. Good work is being accomplished. The club hopes to do greater things in the future. A call meeting Friday was real interesting. The purpose was to raise funds for the Tulsa sufferers as well as the sufferers in this city. I use this to introduce this idea of the correspondents of the Black press. These are local men and women who lived in communities near the newspaper and far from the newspaper, and they would send in their weekly reports about what was going on in their town. So this is the focus of my project. I wanted to look at the local correspondents. This is a question I've had ever since I started doing this research. Who are these people? You know, what are they writing about? And what significant role have they played in the community building aspect of the Black press? Now, I was telling a friend of mine what I was going to be talking about tonight, And she told me, you know, it would really be helpful to hear a little bit about African American history. She said, I went to school, we never talked about it. I knew about the Emancipation Proclamation, knew about the Civil War, knew a little bit about abolition, but didn't know very much about African American history. So I talked to my colleague, Garrett, and I want to give some context then to start this presentation. So here's a list of some of the events that started with the enslavement of persons brought to Virginia in 1619. And then we see the codification of racial law in colonial America. This whole idea of liberty and slavery in the Revolutionary era. The antebellum period, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and the memorialization of the Civil War. The time period that I want to focus on tonight has to do with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and lynching, the convict leasing system, Plessy versus Ferguson, and Jim Crow, and the Great Migration, and the Red Summer race riots that happened during this particular time period. So what this study does is it analyzes the content of these out-of-town reports, identifies representative writers and their stories, and argues that these correspondents and agents help to contribute to the vitality of these newspapers. In particular, correspondents and agents were present in every newspaper. We have them in the Hillsborough Free Press when you talk about daily life, bringing in the news about communities. What's significant about the black press is those kind of events were not covered in mainstream newspapers that were part of the black community. And so the black press then served to provide a function of community building with the kind of events that were happening. Schoolwork, churches, visitors that were coming to town, that sort of thing. So it's very common to find that in other newspapers. So I also want to introduce just a little bit about black press history. The very first black newspaper that was published was called Freedom's Journal. This is in New York City in 1827. And the editors of Samuel Cornish and John Rusham's were the ones who focused on this particular publication. It was an abolition newspaper advocating for the freedom of slaves. I want to read a quote from the first issue. "Too long have others spoken for us. Too long has the public been deceived by misrepresentations in things which concern us dearly." So it's time to be able for people to speak for themselves and to address the issues that concern them and to be an advocacy kind of tool. I think I also need to give some personal context. One of the questions I know people are asking, why is that white woman even interested in talking about black newspapers and studying the black press? That's a good question. While living in Wichita, what seems like eons ago now, but after I graduated from Tabor, I'm a Tabor alum, I worked for an urban mission organization called World Impact, and we lived in northeast Wichita, which is the part of one of the African American communities in Wichita. I met a gentleman by the name of Leonard Garrett in about, I think it was in the 1980s when I met him, and he was editor of the News Hawk, which was a black newspaper that published in Wichita at that time. Well, I was really curious about this on-again, off-again newspaper that was published. It would be distributed for a while, and all of a sudden we wouldn't see it for a while. Then it'd be back again. So when I started my graduate program, my master's program at Wichita State, I had to find a topic to focus on for my first research class. So my question is, why does that newspaper, or newspapers like it, why can't it continue to publish? Well, that was the beginning of a wonderful journey for me that has lasted now since 1994. And my thesis looked at 3 African-American newspapers from Wichita that were published in 1894. And I looked at how was their coverage different than the coverage in a white mainstream newspaper. And then I ended up at the University of Florida studying with Dr. Brunel Tripp, who is a renowned historian of the antebellum Black press. She was my advisor. And so I sort of piggybacked off of her and focused on post-Reconstruction, was kind of my time period. Because in Kansas, we have an incredible repository of newspapers in Topeka at the Kansas State Historical Society. And part of that collection are more than 50 African-American newspapers. And so those papers then became the focus of my dissertation that I finished at the University of Florida. So let me give just a little bit more background about the Black press. So we're talking about sometimes they called it an organ, that would speak for churches, would speak for schools, would speak for a mission, for a cause. And so Freedom's Journal was the first, but there were many that have followed, and this just is the highlights of them. I don't even have the newspapers on here that are part of my study. But the North Star was a newspaper that was published by Frederick Douglass and was part of the abolition movement. The Memphis Free Press and Headlight was Ida B. Wells's newspaper, and it was burned to the ground. The printing press was thrown into a river, and her very good friends were lynched, and she's known for her campaign against lynching. The Chicago Defender in 1905 was very important and necessary in this idea of the Great Migration of blacks from the South moving north, and so they advocated for that. And the Atlanta Daily World was the first daily black newspaper in 1928. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of a picture of that, a little bit of context for my study that I'm focusing on at this time. So my study focuses on 3 newspapers, as Deborah Penner said. So the first one is the Negro Star. Oh, I got this out of order. I turned my page too fast. First one is the Black Dispatch. I put them in chronological order. So the Black Dispatch, as I said before, is published in Oklahoma City. It's no longer publishing. The editor was Roscoe Dungy, and he was particularly active in advocacy for rights for African Americans in Oklahoma. Like many of the black newspapers, it was a weekly paper and was a member of the Western Negro Press and National Negro Press Association. So there were organizations that invited those who were editing newspapers to participate in a professional organization. The second newspaper is the Negro Star. It published in Wichita from 1908 to 1953. And the publisher was Holly T. Sims. He started it in Mississippi, but got a lot of pressure to quit publishing. So he moved his family to Wichita. And he was active with this newspaper until his death in 1953. And so it covered topics that were of interest to African Americans. It carried local and national news, and also promoted businesses of black-owned businesses. And then the third newspaper is the Kansas City Call. It was founded by Chester A. Franklin, sometimes called CA, in 1919. And he also published this paper until his death, until 1955. So it was a local and national news source for African Americans in Kansas City and beyond. He was a strong advocate for civil rights, and that newspaper is still publishing today. So correspondents from Black communities sent their news in from their towns to the newspapers. David Dari, who wrote Red Blood and Black Ink, Journalism in the Old West, writes of asking one longtime editor which factors contributed to his newspaper's longevity. The editor responded, quote, "It is very simple. Each week I print the names of as many of my readers as I can. Everyone reads the paper each week to see if their name or the names of people they know are there." That was happening in the Black press too, okay? By 1928, after nearly 10 years of publishing the Kansas City Call, the volume of news was increasing significantly. There were correspondents in Missouri, Kansas, Texas, and beyond. And so consequently, editor Chester Franklin sought to somehow standardize the format of the news that these correspondents were sending in, hence the name of my study. So he would have block ads where we had recommendations for his correspondence. He required that reports be written on standard size paper. Any news on postcards, scraps of grocery paper, and backs of envelopes will be thrown out. They're important. They were to keep margins and then space that allowed for editing. Same advice I give my media writing students. I want them to double space. For those who had trouble spelling or writing clearly, he would say, get someone to read it first. News that cannot be read and understood easily will be thrown out. So that was sort of the threat over them. And then time and time again, he had to remind them to get it here on time. Can't print it if it's not here. So most newspaper editors, like Franklin, recognized the value of these out-of-town correspondents. They helped to boost subscriptions and readership for their newspapers. So as the Black press transitioned from being more locally focused to nationally focused, and that's what was happening during this time period, these correspondents were vital for the newspaper. These editors, and many like them, I find these correspondents in every Black newspaper I look at when I'm looking in the archives. These editors relied on the correspondents with their local connections in churches, schools, and Black-owned businesses to submit their news about their communities. So in turn then, the correspondents and agents would promote and disseminate the newspapers in their town. That was their job then, to get the news out in their communities, all of which helped to increase circulation. So my research question, one that has persisted for me, is who were these correspondents? More than just their names. What kind of people were they? So the archive for the Kansas City Call is the Kansas City Public Library. I've spent a lot of time there. Kansas State Historical Society has the archive for the Negro Star, and the wonderful thing that is now available, which was not available when I was doing my dissertation, it's all digitized. So you can do keyword searches, track down people, find out information about them. The Black Dispatch is still archived. The majority of its holdings, extant papers, are on microfilm at the Oklahoma Historical Society. Though you can find some digitized copies online now through the Oklahoma Historical Society. So I've made trips to Kansas City, multiple ones, been to Topeka, been to Oklahoma. Sometimes the bylines for these reports listed names of the writers. Many times they do not. Many times they just have the name of the town. And so I would read through the reports, and sometimes the correspondents were writing about themselves, and they would reveal that in their newspapers. I see Peggy nodding her head back there. You know why she's nodding her head? They did that in the German newspapers too, right, Peggy? Okay. So I'm going to talk about 6 correspondents tonight, what I've been able to uncover about them, and what has been, I think, their contribution to these newspapers. So the first one I want to look at is with the Kansas City Call. And Ida B. Kimberling was sending in her news from Leavenworth, Kansas. If you know about Kansas City, you know the metropolitan area. There's a lot of those towns that are closely connected to Kansas City. And then Lillian Chrisman lived in Independence, Missouri, and she would send in her news. Now I picked these two. One, I feel like I know Ida B. a little bit, and have found a lot about her, but I still cannot find a picture of her. Judy and I went to Leavenworth, so I was able to track down her tombstone, her headstone, but I've not been able to find her picture. And I would think with somebody as prominent as her, she wrote for the Kansas City Call for 20 plus years. And I would expect to be able to find a picture of her somewhere, but I've not been able to find one yet. So here's her headstone, or tombstone. It's at St. Muncie Cemetery in Leavenworth. I've been able to track a bit through Ancestry.com. Her family has some connection here, the Kimberlings do, but there's nothing about Ida B. in that list of ancestors. I've tried to correspond with those that are posting things, and they don't really know much about her. So let me tell you what I've been able to learn about Ida B. I was so surprised. You notice she's got a long name now. Ida B. McDonald Clark Kimberling. Well, the reason is I had no clue, but when I was doing my master's research on one of the newspapers in Wichita, it's called The People's Friend, I found out through census records, verifying, confirming, she was there in those newspapers' social news reports, and she was actually sending reports in to some of the newspapers way back then in 1894. Her name was Ida B. McDonald in the newspaper. She was so pleased to find, when I was looking at the census records for 1920, she listed herself as a reporter for a colored newspaper when they're to give their occupation. So she saw this as a job. So she was married twice. She married a gentleman by the name of Clark. I was able to track down their marriage license certification, also read about them in the newspapers. Newspapers.com is wonderful. You know, you can also do keyword searches in there, look for people. And then she divorced Mr. Clark, which I don't know how often that happened, but I think that would have been a socially challenging thing for her to do in that community. She ended up marrying Frank Kimberling, who was also from Wichita, and they moved to Colorado Springs and lived there for several years. And so she was sending news reports then back to Wichita paper back then. Both of their parents served in the Civil War. And there was a home in Leavenworth for them to live as they aged. And so they moved their parents there, and then they moved to Leavenworth, and then that became home for her. She never had children that I've been able to find, none in the census records. And I know you can't go by everything that's in a census record because people sometimes were writing down what they thought, not necessarily what somebody reported, self-reported. But I see no evidence of children, but she was really active in her community, and she had long reports in the call. She was elected as chair for the Republican political club made of, quote, colored women of Leavenworth in 1924. I found that in the Emporia Gazette. So they reported this about her in that paper. And what was even more interesting to me is that I found out that McDonald family had migrated to Kansas as part of the exodusters from Kentucky. If you know that story of African Americans who came from Memphis and from other areas of Kentucky, settled in Kansas. It's how Nicodemus got started. She and her family settled in Bourbon County near Scott City, but then later moved to Wichita. And so I was able to follow her through 20 plus years in the call, and all of a sudden she's not there. Her report isn't there, and so I'm thinking, what's going on? Why is her report not here? Turned out she was sick, and so you read that in other newspaper reports, and she died in 1942 of a lengthy illness. So I still hope someday to find a picture of Ida B. Second person I want to talk about is Lillian Chrisman. She was a longtime resident of Independence, Missouri. Single, at least that's the way they categorized her in the census records. I did find a marriage certificate for her. I don't know what happened to that relationship. She lived with her parents, and if you look in the Independence, Missouri city directory, you see her name there. You also see her father's name, Ambrose, was her father, and they have the same address. So she lived with them. She was a kindergarten teacher, and she was an active member of the Second Baptist Church in Independence. She wrote about that a lot in her columns. And she did write for the call for more than 9 years, and her obituary ran on the front page of the call. Miss Lillian Chrisman, it gives her address, died at her home here Saturday, August 18, following an extended illness. This is 1928. The funeral was held Monday afternoon from the Second Baptist Church, where the deceased had been a member for many years. I knew that, because she wrote about it so often. Miss Chrisman was a member of the well-known Independence family and was born and educated in the city. She was college educated. She attended Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri, and then had taught in rural Illinois. She taught in Oklahoma, and at the time of her death, she was teaching in Independence. So I think what this says to me is the literacy, the education level of the correspondents. And I think that Lillian is representative of that. I'll talk about two correspondents from the Black Dispatch, Viola Gordon and O.T. Willis. So Viola was from Lawton, Oklahoma, and O.T. Willis from Bristow, Oklahoma. So a little bit about Viola. She was born in Georgia, and her husband was Evan Franklin Gordon. She would write in her correspondence, ring 946 for the Black Dispatch. That was her home phone number. And she had two boys, Howard and Prentice, and they delivered the papers, and they would collect the money that was owed for that. The family had a family-run grocery store, and they also were a boarding house. They had people living with them in Lawton. And then in 1920, I read in the Black Dispatch, Mr. and Mrs. Gordon have made their departure from Lawton. They will make their home in Los Angeles. Now, what is just amazing sometimes is the serendipity experiences you have when you're doing research, when you all of a sudden come across something interesting, surprising. this was through Ancestry.com. They have the prison records for California. And Evan Gordon was incarcerated in San Quentin Prison in California in 1926. He was there for 10 years. And I found reports of his trial in the Los Angeles Times. He had shot a man breaking into his grocery store in LA. And so he was incarcerated for 10 years to life, but he was released after 10 years, paroled in 1937. Viola was not listed in the census records then, so I don't know what happened to Viola. He had remarried. His second wife's name was Mona, was listed in the census records. And then O.T. Willis. Tolliver Willis. He was born in Arkansas in about 1872. He moved to Oklahoma as a young boy. And so I've got some clips of the census records there. He had some brothers that he moved with. And I'm not sure about his family because people he was living with do not have his parents' names. So I don't know if they were living with family or what the deal was. He ended up, part of his work experience, he was postmaster at Huntingville Creek Nation Indian Territory in 1903. And then in one of the census records, he was identified as being widowed and living in McIntosh, Oklahoma in 1910. He was a teacher. He was described in one news report as an old school teacher, being a man of good education. So in some of the reports that I read, he was in his 50s. Is that old? He oftentimes referred to himself as the teacher in his reports, and he made reference to having been a principal, and he often wrote about education and school events and concerns in his reports. And then finally, the Negro Star Correspondents. Louise Ratcliffe, not Ratzlaff, Ratcliffe, from Cherryville, which I didn't know where Cherryville was. It's in Montgomery County, Kansas, so down in the southeast corner. And then W.C. Arch, who was from Kansas City, Kansas. So Louise was a 19-year-old in 1920 when she was writing reports. She and her parents lived in Cherryville. They were very active in the Bethlehem Baptist Church. She married an orthopedist, J.H. Dixon, who was quite a bit older than her. But by 1940, the census listed her as age 39, living with her mother in Cherryville, and both were listed as widows. So there have been some changes in their lives. But there's lots of Ratcliffe news in her reports, and she often self-reports about herself, which I tell my students, you can't do that. You know, you've got to report on something else, not yourself. And then this is the one picture that I've been able to find of Walter Caldwell Arch. He was born in Texas and lived in Oklahoma for a time. That's where he met his first wife. Moved to Kansas City. He divorced his first wife, remarried his second wife, and what I thought was really interesting, both his first wife and he reported their kids for the census records. You know, they're both listed in their reports for the census records, which I thought was really interesting. There's more in Ancestry.com about his family. In fact, his daughters, there's some pictures of them as adults in Ancestry.com. Now, this gentleman was a salesman, and that's how he used the newspaper. So he'd be traveling on his routes. He would sell clothing, hair products, burners, and he would run ads in the Star as well as having his reports. So what do the correspondents write about? Well, I've sort of mentioned it already. Church news, sermons, out-of-town guests. We'd have health reports, who was sick, who was getting better. Marriage announcements, weddings, birth and death notices, accomplishments and programs by students in schools. And on occasion, there'd be some editorializing, so I'm going to read this quote for you. "I don't like the spirit of some of our young men. They think they are right and need no advice. Remember the hog that eats the acorn, but never looks to see where it is coming from. So it is with these young men. They never think where their accommodations and schooling come from." And that was from O.T. Willis in the Black Dispatch. So, significance for the Correspondents of the Black Press. They did supply news from surrounding counties. And in fact, my dissertation, I argue that they connected and extended community when you think about having a population of less than 5% of African Americans in a state. They provided incentive for readers to subscribe to newspapers, read about themselves. They personalized the newspaper. And they connected and extended the impact of the Black press. I argue that made a significant and continued to make a significant difference through the history of the Black press. And that's what I have for you tonight. So if there are questions, we got to, Frank, should we see if there are any questions or comments? Yes, Sarah.
This is just curious. You mentioned that, they shouldn't have been writing about themselves, but in retrospect, if they had written about themselves, it helps people in this generation or future to actually see what it was all about. Don't you think so?
I do.
So can we tell our students that?
Well, but let me tell you the other side of the story. Then they want to write about something that they're very, very familiar with, and they don't want to take a risk and learn something new. So that's what I argue for our students, that they need to take some risks and to be stretched in that way. But good comment. Yes, we can learn about that way. Frank?
Did any of these correspondents get paid?
Yes.
So it was a
Meant to talk-
professional, it's a professional.
Yeah, and I'm sure Ida B, that's how she made her money. My grandma sold eggs, and she wrote for the newspaper, but I'm sure she had some of her money that way. The way they would get paid is they would have these agents, they called them, working for them, who would deliver the newspapers, and then when they would give the money, they would get a cut of that. And so the newspaper itself wouldn't pay them, but they would get a cut of when they paid for the newspapers. Yes, Rick?
Thank you so much. This was really interesting. I'm still curious, though, why was the newspaper in 1984 or 1994 being published and then disappearing and then being published?
You mean in 1970?
Or
The
it
News
was-
Hawk
it
was the News Hawk was in 1970. Well, it got down to advertisers. It was a money deal. They just didn't have the money to publish it, and so they would get some money, and then they'd be able to publish it. Yeah. So, but it's a good question. There is a black newspaper publishing in Wichita now. It's called the Community Voice. And so the editor there is very active. In fact, a year ago, January, I took my class for a visit there to meet her and talk to her. I saw another hand. Yes?
When you're researching this, did you study any police records or anything to see if they suffered any backlash?
I expected to find more about that kind of thing in their reports. But I don't know if you saw the one slide where C.A. Franklin told people, focus on the positive. We want to have a good impression about, this was kind of during the racial uplift era too, where people were being able to sort of earn their respect, that sort of thing. But that would be a good place to look for things. And it was just so serendipitous to find out about, Evan being incarcerated in California. So I saw another hand. Chris?
Did you find any of these correspondents reporting on what we would term hard news? Like, would they have been trusted to report on things that, or was it almost exclusively social?
It's almost exclusively social news, right. In the earlier newspapers, like the ones that were part of my thesis and a part of my dissertation, you did have some correspondents there who were doing hard news reporting. There's one by the name of Fearless, was his name, and he would send his reports in not only to Kansas papers, but also the Indianapolis Freeman. He would be reporting that way. So it was more that way then. And there would still be a social page in those newspapers, and probably a lot of that was collected by social editors for the newspapers back then. But as distribution increased, the editors started to rely more on those correspondents and giving them more space in the newspaper too. So, yeah, Keith.
Back to Tulsa.
Okay.
Why did that happen?
Oh, I have it here. It's a very good question. It rings a little true to what's happening these days. There was a young black man, it reminds me of the Emmett Till story. There was a young black man who was accused of attempting to assault a young white woman. He was 19, she was 17. And so a group of black men, he was arrested. A group of black men armed themselves and went to the jail because they were concerned he was going to get lynched. Well, they were met, there was like about 60 of them, and they were met by hundreds of whites there who just went berserk. I mean,
39 square blocks completely destroyed.
39 square blocks completely destroyed.
$519 million of damage in 1921.
What was that again?
$519 million of damage.
$519 million of damage, and that was in 1921.
Over 1,250 or so separate structures destroyed.
Yeah.
And which they denied any access to funds to replenish what damage was done. So,
What did you say?
they went to court and they still weren't replenished with any funds for the damage that was done and business that were destroyed.
This has even been, I wondered some of why maybe what was not said, there's a little bit like raising money, to help people, but if there was some not said, this was really hushed and covered up. I think there was a deep fear of reprisal, from whites in the community. This was like an intense Jim Crow time period lynching that was happening back then. So, Keith?
I didn't know anything about this until a year ago. Why? How could that be? That we didn't know. I mean, it's 100 miles away from us.
Yeah.
It's just appalling to me. And I still remember Ganya saying that growing up in Tulsa as a black student, she didn't know about it.
Yeah, that history was not taught to Danya. Danya didn't know about it. Danya Anderson, when she was growing up. Yes, L3.
Professor, as you enlighten others with this research, do you find that it inspires them in a way as writers? Because I know you work with the writing aspect here. Do you think it inspires writers to go deeper?
A few. I really enjoyed teaching a class a year ago, January. It was called Giving Voice, Stories of the Black Press, and introduced this to students. This was new to them, this history and what this was all about. And there are some people who I think that had an impact on. So. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your attendance.